The King's Daughter is a new film coming to us from director Sean McNamara. He's the man who previously brought us such films as Bratz, Three Ninjas, High Noon at Mega Mountain, Raise Your Voice, the Even Stevens movie, the Sweet Life movie, and a bunch of other straight-to-TV, straight-to-DVD type quality movies. I think there's even like some Baby Geniuses, Cats and Dogs sequels thrown in the mix that no one's really heard of. So, you know, this movie's in great hands. And this movie is about a girl played by Kaya Scodelario, who is the king's daughter, but she doesn't know she's the king's daughter, the king, of course, being Pierce Brosnan. She moves into the palace, though, because the king wants to introduce himself as her dad, but while they're doing this, a mermaid gets brought in. They find one out in the sea somewhere, and they just have a mermaid. She and the mermaid form kind of a bond. She also forms a bond with some dude named Benjamin Walker. Plot happens. When I first saw the trailer for this movie, I was just kind of like, okay, it just looks like a very generic kind of fantasy movie. Of course, it's coming out in the middle of January. Makes sense. You know, it doesn't look like it's going to do that well. But then I looked on Wikipedia at like the production tab, and I was blown away at the history surrounding this movie. This is a movie that's based off of a book that was released in 1997, and development for a movie began in 1999. So this is a movie that's technically been like 23 years in the making. Originally, it was going to be made by the Jim Henson Company, but then like a deal broke between them and Sony, so the project was moved over to Disney, so that kind of started up for a bit. Natalie Portman, I believe, was originally supposed to star in this at one point, but then even that fell through. Eventually, they got it made once they got this director, Sean McNamara. You've assembled a cast, all ready to go, and once they shot it in 2014, with a 2015 release, all of a sudden, it was just pulled from the release schedule. Like 3 weeks before it was supposed to come out in 2015. The reason being they needed to work on the visual effects. So it took them 7 years to release a movie that I'm just going to tell you right now has some fucking horrible visual effects. For this year, for 2015, it looks bad. The mermaid, played by Bing Bing Fan, technically, because it's CGI, but it has like her face, it looks like her. It looks horrendous. You can tell that they're like reusing a lot of the same animation whenever they cut to it. Like, so if it's swimming up to the camera, it looks exactly the same as another shot you've just seen. I literally would not be surprised if they were reusing shots. And also, just it's supposed to be this beautiful, magnificent creature. It has a soul. You're supposed to love this creature, but every time it popped up on screen and got close to the camera, I was like, fuck, this is scary. Like, I can't imagine any kid watching this and going like, fuck, that's beautiful. They'd be like, fuck, I just shit my pants. So them pushing this movie back to work on the visual effects is such a fucking joke. I think more realistically what happened is that once they initially set it back to work on the visual effects, they started to realize this project might be a lost cause anyways. Let's just quietly kind of keep it to ourselves until some suckers buy it from us or something like that. I bet more realistically that's what happened here, because wow, I wouldn't say this is like one of the most embarrassing movies ever made or anything like that. It's one of the worst I've ever seen. That's definitely not true, but it's definitely pretty awful. Like, as soon as the movie opens, it opens with like a Shrek kind of style, like storybook, like here's the book, The King's Daughter. You start to flip pages and it cuts to a Julie Andrews narration that apparently was like done in 2020 when the film rights were bought by Gravitas. Gravitas? Yeah, it's them, I think. Yeah, like it was something they just did, I think. So this is them trying to, I guess, fix the kind of introduction of the movie to, you know, have a narrator to give some more expository kind of details to, you know, keep people engaged. I think they did a pretty awful job with that, though, because I don't remember anything Julie Andrews was talking about. Honestly, the only thing I remember is that she popped up in the beginning and maybe at the very end. I can't remember any points in between where she popped up. It's that underutilized and that unmemorable. And even with this narration where they're trying to, like, you know, let you in on key details, get you invested with the characters a little easier, I think they still did a pretty awful job. Everything feels so rushed on the end of introducing the characters and just getting shit to keep going. Like, Kaya Scodelario is an actress who I'm always rooting for. I've been a fan of hers for a while, but in this movie, like, her character is just kind of like, she doesn't know she's the king's daughter, so she's living with a group of nuns for a while, and they talk about how, like, oh, she's a crazy one, I can't believe she's actually a nun, because she's crazier than all of us. And the only thing they give you, like, an example of to show, like, yeah, she's a rule breaker is she went swimming in the ocean when I guess they weren't supposed to go do that, so they put her in a timeout. But then after that, she gets immediately kind of like transported to the palace, like, you're gonna live here now, dude. And it's like, they have not established well enough what kind of transition, what kind of fish out of water scenario this is going to be, going from this place to this place. So I feel absolutely nothing for this character going forward. In fact, like, when she gets there, this movie does a weird thing where they, like, want to, showcase how she doesn't fit in, or like she's a little more weird or awkward than all of us here who already live here. So they cut to shots of the extras, walking and kind of giving her funny looks and all that. And every single time they do something like that, where they do a close-up of an extra, it always looks weird. Like, this movie has a problem with editing. It's really bad. There's several points where the cuts are weirdly lined up. There's a dance scene with Pierce Brosnan and Kaya Scodelario that is fucking butchered in the editing room. But it also makes you think, like, well, if it was that butchered, how bad was the filmmaking on the day, kind of, But also, like, those edits in particular also, like, I feel like you're trying to give us, like, more character with the community, but once again, I feel nothing. The intention is not landing for me, and emotionally, I'm not connecting with anything. Like, there's a friend character, of course, because there's always a best friend character for these main characters, where she just shows up at the palace and she's like, hello, I'm here to be your servant, I think. I think that's what the dynamic is, but I'm also going to be your friend. I'm only going to care about your troubles and your needs and your wants, and you don't even ever have to ask about anything personal about me or anything like that. And it's just so tired. It was just such, like, as soon as they brought in, like, the best friend, I was like, oh god, I can already tell this character is not going to be anything really. At the end of this movie, I'm not going to care. They probably won't even show her. And they don't. She just disappears. She doesn't exist if Kaya Scodelario doesn't need her. But what's potentially even worse here is the flatline kind of chemistry between her and Benjamin Walker. Kaya Scodelario, as far as, like, acting, Kaya Scodelario isn't awful in this, but when you work with material like this, there's not really enough time to shine. There's one person who does, who I'll get to in a second, but Benjamin Walker, he is just kind of like, I'm just the generic handsome guy who for some reason is kind of falling for Kaya Scodelario, I think just based off of looks, because it's not like, I don't know, there's not really anything here to actually connect us initially. It seems almost kind of instantly where he's kind of like, I'm smitten with you, I think, oh my god. It's a movie that kind of weirdly feels unsure about what it's doing. Like, it's going quickly enough and so much stuff is happening where you get the vibe of, like, they just kind of want to get this over with. But I feel like it's more so like, well, if we keep things moving, maybe hopefully people don't start to question a lot of the character motivations or any of the character wants or anything like that. Because another problem I have is that, the introduction for all the characters is weak. It's very rushed and quick, especially between the character relationships, whatever mood they're going for. But also, as the movie goes on, I didn't think they were really well defined, because Kaya Scodelario starts making decisions, other characters start making decisions, and I'm like, what was actually the push to do this anyways? Like, I'm honestly losing track of what any of these characters really want, because I'm not really sure I know. I'm not really sure if anyone in the movie knows. Maybe the actors do, because, mentally they have to get to that place to play the character, so maybe they make up stuff, or maybe they knew something we didn't, but it's just, this finished product doesn't really convey anything to me. The only thing I can really say that stands out as far as, like, something I could connect with is Pierce Brosnan. Not saying the character is really all that great. It's a lot of, like, generic king kind of stuff, like a lot of this movie. It's a lot of generic kind of fantasy plotting and all that. There's, like, a ticking clock element in the third act that I honestly can't tell you why it was important. They kept trying to remind you, like, hey, there's a time limit based off of this, and I'm like, but why? Was that there before? What's actually about to happen if they don't do the what? And couldn't tell you, and if it was there, I would then argue, like, if the movie was more engaging, if I cared more about everything else going on, then I would act, then this thing wouldn't fall so much under the radar. But going back to Pierce Brosnan, he was the one who, despite the wig, you know, he was the one who showed up on set and seemed like he was having a good time. Just every time he was on screen, I was like, some light, you know, some real acting going on. Especially like when you compare his performance to the likes of William Hurt in this movie, who's like a fill-in, a last-minute replacement for Bill Nighy. And William Hurt very obviously doesn't want to be there. He's like, every single line he delivers is like he's about to fall asleep. You know, he wants to just go home. He doesn't want to make this fucking movie anymore. It's honestly, it's quite funny actually watching him do this movie and just constantly see him in scenes and you're like, you maybe we should have just replaced you with somebody else. You know, we should have gotten somebody else other than you. Maybe a new actor. Maybe we don't need a name specifically. The only other thing other than Pierce Brosnan that I can say that I liked in this movie is like, you know, the set design work and the costume work, you know, the things that are practical, I guess. It looks very good. You know, you can tell there's a lot of time and effort put into making this tangible, you know, visually fascinating place. And, you know, it's not a bad location for a film, for like a fantasy kind of adventure / kind of romance movie like that. I just wish that the movie was better. I wish that they were making an actual good movie here, because even like a lot of the adventure stuff, you know, it feels very confined to the limited locations they have. It doesn't feel like they really took full advantage of like their location, what they could potentially do with, you know, the stuff that they had. I didn't mention this before, but obviously I have not read the book that this is based off of, so, you know, I'm not trying to critique the book or anything like that, but in the context of just this movie, I feel like they could have done a lot more to make the plot at least a little bit more interesting, add a little bit more flair to it, where you're like, hey, you know, that was actually kind of cool what you're doing there. It might have been done before, but you're doing it now, and it's kind of interesting considering the rest of the context. This movie's just fairly kind of generic as far as like its fantasy storytelling and its plotting, especially like the score of it. It's like that generic kind of fantasy whimsy that you hear a million times, and like if you played this in the midst of like a bunch of other kind of like fantasy movies, it probably would get lost in the shuffle of like, okay, this could literally be the music to anything, because it's not really that distinct or really memorable. That being said, when I was like watching this movie, I was actually having a pretty solid time with it. It's awful and it has a ton of issues, don't get me wrong, but you know, in combination with the fact that Pierce Brosnan was keeping me entertained, you combine that with the fact that, you know, when I'm watching it, I'm trying to think like, what kind of thought process was a studio exec having, you know, when they were watching this, and why they wanted to keep it on the shelf for so long, you know, oh yeah, that's, you know, and just like kind of laughing at everything that they kind of get wrong. But the most baffling part for sure is the ending, not necessarily like the third act, but like the right at the ending where, you know, they kind of end in a point where, once again, I'm thinking like, do you really have to end it here? Is that really all that necessary? Whatever, the movie's about to wrap up, whatever. This movie, another thing it does is that it'll occasionally throw in like a modern day pop song in the mix, and that certainly doesn't work for capturing a tone or like a time period or anything like that. But, you know, the storybook is closing, the Shrek kind of storybook is closing on the movie, you know, the end, whatever, and under that tag, it says like, it's just the beginning. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, okay, if this was like a movie that, you know, Netflix bought from a shelf somewhere, or like Hulu, Amazon, some other streamer, they bought it and they released it, I could potentially see why they would still keep that on to like hint at more sequels or anything like that, because it's like, hey, streaming, you know, you can count how many people are watching it if there is like a particular interest in seeing more of these just based off of how many people watch this. So sure, why not? Especially if we promote the fact that, you know, this has been on the shelf forever, people are going to be interested, people will watch it. Maybe this could be a success, maybe we could make more and then make them actually good. But this was bought by not a streamer, it was bought by Gravitas, who then released it to theaters, and it flopped horribly. And it's like, sure, people have high expectations for things all the time, you know, it's a very natural thing for people to do, but when it comes to buying this movie based off a book that I don't think anyone really cares about, buying this movie that nobody knows a whole lot about, and you know, at least me, I only just recently discovered this, and I like to consider myself being someone who was like pretty in the know about what was coming out, what was being made in films in 2015. You know, I was doing a YouTube channel in 2015, so, you know, I feel like I would have known. And they've decided to release it into theaters in the middle of Scream, in the middle of Spider-Man still kicking, and Sing 2, you know, all these other movies that are doing better, to just, you know, flop and die. Like, it's like a fish that you drop on, like, the pier, and it just, like, flops around, and people are watching like, damn, you know, why are we letting this happen? You know, let's put it in the thing, or something like that. You're like, pretty entertaining, though, if you're just gonna watch it just to have it in the back of your mind, like, you know, this is the movie that people were holding on a shelf forever, but still not very good. I'm gonna give The King's Daughter a D+. I actually would recommend you watch it, like I said, just to see why, because there's definitely, if you want to think like, okay, I'm a studio executive, why am I putting this movie on a shelf? And you start to tally everything up and think about everything, you're like, oh yeah, that's another thing. You might actually have a good laugh with it, and you might actually enjoy Pierce Brosnan, because I certainly enjoyed watching Pierce Brosnan in the movie. You might admire some of the actual practical effects work, you know, that a lot of hardworking people put time and effort into. That being said, everything else about the movie is pretty awful. Horrible visual effects, you know, bad storytelling, bad acting, mostly from, because I mostly blame Sean McNamara for that. You know, it's a lot of like just the directing, I think. You know, it's a lot of just directing and writing where the execution of this movie really bogs it down. Oh well. Hopefully this doesn't happen to some other poor movie out there. You know, we have high ambitions, and then they push it back for VFX work, and it stays on a shelf before it's released, you know, by some production company you've never heard of that releases it to die. Who am I kidding? That's definitely going to happen to some other movie at some point, but whatever. If you've seen The King's Daughter, leave in the comments below what you thought of it, and as always, thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe. I'm Jackson Fulcher. See you guys next time.